Дякую, Лесю, for that great introduction. And we have a bit of an interesting sort of, I think you unplugged me there. We sort of have an interesting discussion. We're sort of transitioning from geopolitics to our community. And I think what's fascinating about this panel, and I was just thinking to myself as Howard was talking about, how do I loop in building the next generation of future generations of the Ukrainian diaspora and the institutions that make them strong with the geopolitical strategy? And I was thinking to myself, I'm going to give a real example. On Tuesday, I've been invited by Canada's Minister of Defense and Canada's Foreign Minister to attend the UN Peacekeeping Ministerial on Tuesday, which was bringing together 70 countries, 70 UN countries, to talk about peacekeeping. And obviously, peacekeeping for Ukraine is a major issue. And the reason why we are invited is because of the sophistication of the Ukrainian Canadian community in engaging with government. And I think we have to take apart what that means and how do we get there. Because it's important to understand what are those institutions that help ensure that level of influence and that level of engagement. Like Howard mentioned, there is an expectation that we need to continue to engage the decision makers in our respective countries, and also to engage decision makers in Ukraine, because we do play an important role, but we can only do so if we play a sophisticated role. And so what I want to talk today about is how do we get there. But before doing that, I have a video clip that sort of outlines how we're doing it here in Canada, and then I'll go back to how we continue to build this into the future.
Just a few weeks after the very successful first ever 24th Ukrainian Canadian Congress in Toronto, attended by leaders of all main Canadian political parties, including a public fireside chat with the Prime Minister of Canada, Mr. Harper, Maidan erupts in Ukraine, setting in motion unbelievable and unprecedented events. The Ukrainian Canadian Congress is at the forefront, organizing local help and sending aid to Ukraine in support for the fight for dignity.
High quality, wonderful group of volunteers.
A new Ukrainian government is formed and receives the support of the Canadian government. Prime Minister Harper is the first NATO and G7 leader to visit Ukraine in support of the legitimacy of the new government, and convinces G8 leaders to expel Russia and to impose sanctions.
And while Ukraine may not have a seat at the table, I can assure you, Mr. President, that the situation here will be very high on Canada's agenda.
The UCC president becomes the only non-governmental official to be declared persona non grata and sanctioned by Russia.
The only Ukrainian that has made it onto Mr. Putin's I love you list. So we introduce right now Mr. Paul Grod, President of the Ukrainian Canadian Congress.
Perfect timing. The UCC President is named among top 100 influencing Canada's global future. The Ukrainian Canadian Congress is first in the category of diaspora and civil society. UCC, together with our member organizations, actively organize support both from our community and the Canadian government for military, humanitarian, and economic support for Ukraine. Subsequently, UCC supports the visit of President Poroshenko and his address to both houses of parliament, as well as Premier Yatsenyuk's visit to further the free trade agreement. The UCC is proactive in the Canadian federal election campaign in a non-partisan manner to ensure all parties and candidates understand and formally endorse issues of importance to our community.
He has built over 50 military bases along Ukraine's border, including air bases. That's why we come back to, we need to provide the proper aid to Ukraine. You need people that understand the situation and people who aren't timid to fight for what is required.
Today, the UCC continues its strong advocacy position with the new government, establishing strong relations with the new government and MPs. The Canada-Ukraine Business Forum in June 2016 heralds the beginning of a new era. Attended by the Prime Minister of Canada, Justin Trudeau, and the Premier of Ontario, Kathleen Wynne, and hosted by International Trade Minister Chrystia Freeland, community focus extends to bilateral economic and trade issues between Canada and Ukraine.
Because, as Prime Minister, I am eager to build on the good work of my predecessors and solidify the warm friendship between our two countries.
The Prime Minister, in his mandate letter to me, instructed me to work really, really hard on the free trade agreement with Ukraine. You can imagine I wasn't unhappy to see that in the letter. He's given me a target to aim for by announcing the date of our visit, and I think Natalia and I will be working very, very hard in the days to come.
Just a few short weeks later, the UCC president and a community delegation is invited to join Prime Minister Justin Trudeau on a historic trip to Ukraine to sign the long-anticipated Canada-Ukraine Free Trade Agreement.
This free trade agreement and the work we are going to continue to do, investing in Ukraine, having Ukrainians invest in Canada, creating opportunity, creating prosperity through trade is a big piece of why the deal we signed today is going to have a real impact on both of our peoples. The conflict in the east, the illegal occupation of Crimea weighs heavily not just on Ukrainians but on people around the world who believe that the rule of law and the sovereignty of Ukraine needs to be respected, and that's why Canada will always stand with Ukraine.
Today, the UCC continues its focus in support of Ukraine, rebuilds a youth internship program for Ukrainian Canadian youth in both Canada and Ukraine, and by supporting the Free Trade Agreement, ensures a solid financial foundation for the future.
Well, I'll just jump into my presentation, and I do have it on PowerPoint. I'll start off by talking about, and my topic today is within the context of a vision for the Ukrainian diaspora for the next 2 generations. And my topic really is defining ways to make the Ukrainian diaspora institutionally even stronger. I think one of the challenges that we face today is that our community has become much more, very virtual. And that has pros and cons. The pro is that we can mobilize quickly, that information is shared much quicker than it ever has been. But what we've sacrificed as a result of that are the strong institutions that ensure the continuous community development. And we just can't be necessarily a Facebook platform of a community. It's an important means, but it's not the community itself. So really what I want to do is talk about over the past 50 years, what has the Ukrainian World Congress provided? Where have we been in the last 50 years, and where do we need to go going forward? Number one, it's provided outstanding leadership and coordination for Ukrainian communities globally and advocacy for Ukraine. So that's what when we look at what is the Ukrainian World Congress and what has it done, that's I think the defining principle. The World Congress and its member organizations have kept our community strong and united by, number one, building consensus among our community organizations, never losing sight of our grassroots, because it's one thing for us to, for Yevhen to meet with leaders of various European countries or globally, or myself to meet with ministers and Prime Minister of Canada, but if we don't have a strong grassroots, it really is very superficial, and really the politicians see through that. And so what we need to do is continue to focus on our grassroots. Those grassroots organizations are extremely important. I think it was mentioned earlier in Boris's presentation, the Minister of Defense of Canada, Chyczij, has been meeting with our communities across the country. He was just recently in Toronto. Before then, he was in Vancouver meeting with our Hromada. He's been to Regina and many other cities. And he's meeting with our community to hear from them. Are they sharing the same sentiment that I am when I go to Ottawa? And that's why having that united, coordinated community is extremely important. Because every city he goes to, whether he meets with the president of UCC Toronto, Taras Bahri, and he hands them the briefing note that I handed to him a month ago in Ottawa, they see that there is a structure and there's a consensus that we've built. And that is extremely important. And that's important to have globally as well. We have to also think about how we provide valuable services to our community, because that community will only be connected when they feel that there is benefit to them. And sometimes that's difficult as community leaders to sort of get your head around, saying, well, don't they get it that we have to go and build consensus and develop strategies for how we can support Ukraine? But at the end of the day, people want to, young families, they want to ensure that their children have a Ukrainian daycare, a Ukrainian youth organization, some sort of social services. New immigrants want to be able to find services. And these are all very important components. And that's how many of our communities have been very, very successful in attracting immigrants, in maintaining strong, conscientious communities, because they do offer services to those new immigrants that come. And once those new immigrants feel that they've received valuable service, then they will want to continue to contribute to that community. So providing valuable services is an extremely important part of strong communities. And also being a credible, united voice of the community. When government hears from multiple groups in a community, whether it be in a country, in a city, or internationally, they all of a sudden say these people just don't have their act together. I'm hearing from this group that they're advocating for one issue. Another group is coming to me with all different types of priorities, and at that point we completely lose our game. We lose any ability to influence decisions because we're not united and we're not speaking with one coherent voice. We can't go into government with a laundry list of 13 different issues. We have to say, this month we're focusing on these two particular issues or one particular issue, because that's what we need to focus and we need to rally the entire community around. So what we have to do in terms of defining our vision is firstly, we need to define our raison d'etre. I think one of the challenges that we've faced in the last 25, 26 years of Ukraine's independence is really what is our raison d'etre. So historically, the World Congress, when you look at its first 25 years of history, has been focusing on developing an independence for Ukraine. Post-independence, we see our raison d'etre has sort of shifted to promoting democracy and Euro-Atlantic integration for Ukraine. But we've really taken a hands-off approach from nation building in Ukraine. And I think that's been one of our biggest mistakes that we've made as the organized Ukrainian diaspora. We've taken a hands-off approach for Ukraine. I think that post-revolution of dignity, which I'd call sort of the second or third phase rather, first phase being pre-independence, second phase being between independence and the Maidan of the Revolution of Dignity. And the third phase of our engagement is the post-Maidan, the post-Revolution of Dignity. I think we've woken up and realized that we do have a responsibility. First of all, we stood up and said we need to help Ukraine from a security perspective, humanitarian aid, although that's perhaps dissipating right now, economic development, and reforms. And I think it's important for us to be able to give that diaspora, our community, that raison d'etre. When somebody says to you, they're sort of second, third, fourth generation born in that country, they often ask themselves, I'm really comfortable living in my country of where I live today, whether it's the UK, the United States, Australia, Greece, wherever it may be. And it's really easy to assimilate. And I think it's really incumbent upon us, if we're thinking about the future, is we need to build strong institutions so that those Ukrainians living in those countries start to develop that sense of, I have a purpose, I have a mission. And the one community, the one group that has done this extremely successfully, which we could take a lot of example from, is our friends in the Jewish community. And that they've created that sense of, you must be a patriotic Jew. You must think about Israel and help Israel. Because what happened to us during the Second World War can happen to us again if we're not strong and united. And therefore, we need to create that raison d'etre. What is it that defines us? That you can say to your children or your grandchildren and say to them, this is why you need to be Ukrainian. And this is why we need to say to immigrants who come to our countries, this is from Ukraine. We need to say to them, this is why you need to stay Ukrainian, because Ukraine needs us. We have a responsibility in Ukraine's future. We have a responsibility not only in terms of influencing our governments internationally, but also being nation builders in Ukraine. And I think that's a fundamental shift in our view, and not just us as a diaspora, but also the Ukrainians in Ukraine, whether it's the Ukrainian government or NGOs. We have to start looking at this as, and it was mentioned yesterday, that we are a 65 million nation. Not 20 million diaspora and 45 million living in Ukraine. We are 60 million strong together. And us as 65 million, we have an obligation and responsibility to become those nation builders. But we can only do that with strong institutions. So this is why we have to think to ourselves is, how do we build those institutions? So now we're saying, okay, we know where we need to go. We need to become nation builders. But in order to do that, we have to have strong, conscientious communities around the world. How do we build that? Well, first of all, let's take a look at how Ukrainians define themselves. I put them into really kind of four major categories. Number one category are those, I'll call them the diehards, those that are committed to building a new Ukraine. The second category are those that love Ukrainian culture. And that's about the extent of it. Ukraine's a faraway place. They don't really have a lot of connection to it. Maybe have been there, maybe haven't been there, but they love the culture. They love to dance, they love the song, they love the Ukrainian art, but they consider themselves Ukrainian. And if you look at most recent census in Canada, I mentioned was 1.4 million Canadians in last census in 2016 define themselves or identify themselves of Ukrainian heritage, which is a great number. But we need to distill that down and ask, okay, well, how many of those put themselves in the various categories? And a large percentage define themselves with that cultural aspect and not necessarily that die-hard patriotic aspect of it. The next is... The third category are those that are engaged in their church, and often their church only. And I'll say that is both traditional and non-traditional. When I say traditional, non-traditional, the traditional for me are the Ukrainian Catholic and the Ukrainian Orthodox churches. But now we have a large wave of non-traditional churches. Those are the evangelical churches. And you see many, especially among new immigrants, really connecting to those churches and may or may not have a Ukrainian tinge to it, but also very connected to the church. Maybe less so to the culture and maybe less so to Ukraine. And then the fourth category is, my Baba was Ukrainian. And that's the category that many fall into. But what's important is all four of these categories have the potential to become strong supporters of Ukraine. It's a matter of how you nurture them. And I will put people like James Bazan, who we heard from yesterday, into the fourth category, or he was when he first came into politics. Because I met James when he first got elected, and he was, yes, my Dido, my Baba were Ukrainian. Today, he's one of the strongest advocates for Ukraine that we have in Canada's Parliament, and that's an example of how we need to work with these groups. So let's talk about threats of maintaining and developing conscientious Ukrainian diaspora. It's assimilation, it's apathy, and it's lack of purpose. And to overcome such threats, we have to develop strong institutions. And many of you heard me say this before. I believe that really the key to success is looking at our community, building a strong community from cradle to grave. And that is from your Ukrainian daycares to your Ukrainian schools, cultural centers, youth organizations, arts organizations, professional business groups, political organizations, social service organizations, and getting into care centers, senior centers, and also Ukrainian cemeteries. But it's true. It does give that sense of community, that sense of, you know what, I'm going to be Ukrainian throughout my entire history. And at certain points, you can go to those people because you know where they are, because they gather places. And so and you continue to keep them engaged and feeling Ukrainian. So in building an institutionally even stronger Ukrainian diaspora, I wanted to define strong when we talk about a strong community. Number one, they have to be conscientious. Conscientious meaning patriotic. They feel Ukrainian. So to do that, you need schools, youth organizations, student organizations, cultural communities. They need to be organized, meaning we need viable organizations. All kinds of different organizations. I define organizations as a cultural community, a youth community, a political community, a business community. These are all important organizations that we need to continue to build and foster. United. What's critical is all these organizations must be united under one national umbrella. And that's one of the challenges that many of our communities around the world are challenged with. But we need to continue to focus on that and make sure everybody understands the value of one united umbrella nationally. Influential and affluential. They need to be politically savvy. We need to educate, elect, and influence. To educate, we need to do projects like internship programs. The Ukrainian Canadian Congress just recently relaunched its national internship program. And in fact, we have one of our interns here with us today, Helena Padichuk. Helena is over here. And this is an example of, if we want to have influential and politically savvy Ukrainian Canadian leaders, we need to have more people like Helena. We just restarted this program, and Helena's working for the Minister of Foreign Affairs. What a cool job right after university. So we need to do more of those kinds of things. We need to elect people. We need to elect more people into office. That's why we all stand behind Natalia Lishchina, who's councillor for Oakville, and encouraging her to get more involved in politics, and others around us. Because we see what having people like Boris and Christia in government mean to promoting that agenda. Next is financial capability. We need to raise the next generation of business leaders so they can help finance what we want to accomplish as a community. And we need to be sophisticated. That's in terms of defining what strong is. Multi-stakeholder engagement. And a great example of that, and I know that UKK does this, and the Ukrainian Canadian Congress does this, and that is working with other communities. Whether it's, and I mentioned CEEC, which is an acronym for Central and Eastern European Coalition or Council, where we bring together other communities to help us in supporting some of those key initiatives. Next slide. The other thing to appreciate is the community is not a monolith. People have varying interests throughout their what I'll call life cycle. At one point, you may be just focused on your kids and making sure they go to a good Ukrainian school, hopefully, and go to participate in youth organizations. But at every single stage, you may be able to pull them in for different reasons. And if our community institutions serve those needs, communities stay and become strong. And as I mentioned, this is where we need to also look at how do we professionalize our community organizations. And again, good examples, what I'll point to are UKK, their SUB, Союз Українців Великобританії, the Ukrainian Canadian Congress, that have professional staff, because you can't run it all on volunteers. Volunteers are a huge driving force, but you need to help keep them organized and to professionalize our community organizations. And again, this is all around the theme of how do we build strong community for generations to come. So again, strong communities only exist with strong institutions that meet our community needs, locally, nationally, and globally. Strong communities that have the political and financial clout to influence governments and policy communities. And only then can we be truly effective in supporting Ukraine. If we're not influential in our own countries, we can't be influential in helping push Ukraine in the right direction. Maybe на цьому я завершу. I'll just conclude it by saying that if we want to be able to work at the level that we're talking about at this panel, to be able to influence both Ukrainian and our respective governments, we need to have strong diaspora communities, and to build strong diaspora communities, we need to have strong institutions that really focus on ensuring strong, conscientious Ukrainians for generations to come. Щиро дякую.